All right, the 1AC should be sent. Are y'all there?
Yeah.
Just the doc.
Okay, yeah, no worries.
I got it. Just give me like 1 second to download. You can start.
Okay, yeah, no worries.
And I'm good to go whenever.
Okay, cool.
Good now.
All right, give me 1 second to pull up my timer, and then I will start. And I'm gonna grab a sip of water real quick, then I'll get the 1AC. All right. The standard is maximizing expected well-being and minimizing suffering, pleasure, good, pain, back, negative 86. Pleasure and pain are always questions of value. They are experienced with people feel past, we feel a desire, aversion, everyone takes a what is a action in a simple way. What value have to be assigned to pleasure and pain? There's no possibility that pleasure and pain have no value. We cannot form a with objective standpoint withhold endorsement of value judgment we make concerning our own consciousness. That outweighs one intuitions. They're the foundational basis of any argument. And theories that contradict our own intuitions are most likely false, even if we can directly determine why. Second, binding is pain and pleasure are intrinsically binding and guide action. If an ethical theory can't guide action, then anyone could say why not and opt out anything else. Also, skepticism to be considered obligations, absent grounds for accepting them. Independently, threats to life preclude action based off other theories, since crises inhibit the ideal considered conditions that theories presuppose. Prefer additionally one actor's specificity outweighs, since different moral agents have different standings and ethical obligations. A side constraints freeze action because government policies always require trade-offs. The only justifiable way to resolve these conflicts is by benefiting everybody. B, no activation distinction for states, since they implicitly assume culpability related to public domain by creating permissions and prohibitions. Second, no intent force a distinction. A, actions are deformed by predictions from mental space, so consequences are a collective of the will, and states lack wills and intentions, since policies are collective action. B, if we foresee a consequence, then it becomes part of our deliberation, which makes it intrinsic to our actions, and we intend it to happen. Third, reject Calcinites empirically denied because governments and people use a daily and metaphysically sound principle of science that can make approximate correct causal relationships that prove gravity warming vaccines etc. proves consequentialism is true. Fourth, use epistemic modesty for value affirmative. That means compare the probability of the framework times the magnitude of the impact of our framework. Prefer a substantially true since it maximizes the probability of achieving the most moral value. Beating a framework might act as a mitigation to their impacts, but the strength of that mitigation is contingent. B, clash. We don't know if our frameworks are true, but we can debate the topical question that is incentivizes debating both layers instead of solely focusing on framework. Fifth, moral uncertainty means preventing existential risk should be our highest priority. That's Bostrom. 13, moral uncertainty just present understand why be confused if we're uncertain. Those good values are really recognize value, ensuring their future is the best way to increase probability the future will contain lots of value. The advantage is crisis stability. Loss development has started new arms threatening nuclear deterrence. That's Claire 19. Storms that played well by attack subs on their own air force, drones destroy radars on their own, could weaken barriers to nuclear war. Several countries accelerated development to prevent adversaries from gaining gaining advantage. The Army envisioned armed robotic vehicles, Navy and DARPA testing UAVs, Russia unveiled unmanned ground vehicles, China working on autonomous systems, and dual-use technology and exports ensure fast proliferation and arms racing. That's Albinus Tower 17. AWS now requires specific military technology development path as tech for civilians for militaries will make use research well underway across countries, university laboratories, and commercial enterprises making use of the free market to lower prices and shorten innovation. AWS now requires exotic components and cloud design are available to a wide range of actors. Less scrupulous actors will by development easier recruit AWS could be put together with technology not available by non-state actors. Software for this copy via computer network operations prolific could occur via exports to extremist groups. Should one of the leading nations take go forward, others would follow suit. Development could trigger stabilizing arms race, and laws are unique. A pass accelerates arms racing and makes conflict escalation impossible. That's Horowitz 19. Opacity starting laws with competition, difficulty credibility demonstrated capabilities, differences, software and hardware meaning verification would be difficult, uncertainty about tech and applications, significant uncertainty. Countries invest a lot to do fear of what others are developing. Rules of engagement would be unknown, and they could have to change their programming. Worst case assumption by adversaries make others likely. Uncertainty makes it harder for countries to come to agreement. Private information means both sides believe that they're likely to win. The dispute becomes more likely to escalate, and continued development goes nuclear. One ensures malfunction, escalate by signaling checks to prevent go to escalation. Non-polar incidents too. That's Albinus Hour 17. Increasing operational space in human development would be limited to general oversight. Any situation would not allow for human ponderings, form control of autonomous algorithms. Software would react by within a split second by counterattack. impacting user loose situation, even false indications, simulated trigger moves, or simple malfunction of trigger escalation, not tested beforehand, interaction unpredictable, could result in escalation, erroneous indication of attack barrier from sunlight to magnetic training tapes, reasoning led to reconsideration possibility to flight time to several hours, as well as communication with the goal of military effectiveness, providing incentive to increase speeds without human intervention, mechanisms for reconsideration of the low humans to function as fail-safes are described for foreseeable algorithm interaction, increased prices and stability, reminiscent of accidental war, and second, automation by its inability to empathize or understand context and security dilemma ensures escalation. That's Johnson 20. Tech remains finally limited due to partly misidentify objects and be easily skewed. Errors are often inexplicable. Baby holding a toothbrush misidentified as a baseball bat. Unpredictable errors would inherently destabilizing. Inability to understand context or empathize would become a liability. AI systems fail simultaneously and repeat indefinitely. Implicitly would worsen instability. Systems that pursue advantages might perceive to escalate as attack risk of burst risk instability. Tendency to use automation as replacement for vigilant supervision could mean that defense planners view decisions generated by AI as superior to humans. Over reliance will create strategic instability. Third, first risk laws and incentivize first risk by reducing political and monetary costs. Even the perception of future capability destabilizes nuclear postures. That's Alvin and Tower 17. AWS introduces stronger incentive for attacks. Unmanned systems keep soldiers out of harm's way, which reduce political risk, switching to boxes. Unmanned systems become stealthier due to radio silence. Their resulting room for maneuver increases. Systems can be cheap and disposable. Forms would make defense difficult due to resilience and ability to attack from many different directions simultaneously. New meaning for current assassinations and decapitations. Strong incentive to be the first in the offensive. Worst case thing might see a comeback in Russia alarm when the idea was floated in the U.S. forms could attack nuclear delivery, command and control its sensitive infrastructure components. Even though the attacker might have little interest, that strikes were possible would increase distrust. AWS would open new possibilities for holding nuclear submarine, but assume as risk when perceived to be a great risk. Conventional capabilities increase instability and strategic levels. Unmanned systems increase the risk of military force will be used, and where unmanned systems have presented caution-inducing hurdles confirm war gaming and nuclear war's existential. Climate masturbation, ice age, and meltdowns. That's Star 14. Leading climatologists about the consequences of war, disruption of climate and ozone. 2 billion people starve. War would leave the earth uninhabitable. Firestorms produce smoke, which remain for at least a decade and destroy ozone. Block sunlight, create ice age temperatures below freezing limit. Overseas, EMP would destroy all electronic devices, including nuclear plants, and meltdown would really fall over activity. Survivors starve. Dude, that solvency plan states ought to ban lethal autonomous weapons. Only a permanent binding ban that includes all state self-certification. It's all been in Tower 17. Moratorium seems unwise due to dual use nature, and east of which such an agreement can be swallowed on an agreement. Does nothing on strategic stability. Only a few states can declare weapons series without obligation to share the results of agreement between major powers. The resulting loss of capabilities would be secret. Only the states would agree on binding agreements, not subject to verification. Ban by promise enough advantages from international community to address verification. The best solution would be a bright red line against AWS. And enforcement's effective incentive structures, evidence trails, and inspections ensure compliance. That's Grubbin et al. 13. Parties accept instruction, sharing data, and monitoring to promote compliance of other states, as well as refuting spurious allegations. Evidence in this video that includes controls and console command received by console encrypted in physical keys needed to operate the weapon at times immediately prior to including the engagement hash recorded by Glassbox with timestamp. If even a single bit were altered, the hash would not match. UEFI is periodically download held in a repository. All right. Open for cross.
Okay. Okay, let's start on the framework. Can you explain the bindingness argument?
Yeah, sure. So the argument is that pleasure and pain are inherently binding. You act in your own self-interest because of pleasure and pain. So, for example, the kind of example given in the Nagel evidence is that the reason you don't put your hand on a hot stove is because it causes you pain. That is the primary reason, which means it's most binding because it is only motivational ethic.
Yeah, how does that example operate in the context of like a moral situation? Like touching a stove isn't really something that's morally guiding. So how does this bindingness like apply in
at least according to our framework, because we would argue that putting your hand on that hot stove would be kind of a bad action to take.
Yeah, but how is that a moral question?
Because morality is kind of, I guess, the study of like normative ethics that's meant to kind of guide your action in different situations. This is a situation in which kind of ethics and morality will come into play because it is a situation where you can take potential actions and you have to determine what action to take.
Cool. The extreme evidence impact justified. How is this normative or come to a normative conclusion?
So the argument indicates that if we're uncertain about our moral theory as of now, we should kind of preserve our ability to deliberate upon moral theories, which necessitates the existence of life, which means preserving life and the ability to kind of determine those things is a prior question to other frameworks because we're not certain. I don't think it's impact justified. It just kind of appeals to the idea that we should have a framework, which is, I think, an argument for every single framework.
Jump to the STAR evidence. Can you explain the nature of this study?
The nature of the study. So I believe that the STAR study kind of analyzed, did like a simulation of dropping nukes on different kind of locations and would kind of look at the fallout from that. I think it looks at kind of the way the particles distribute and like go into the atmosphere and stuff and what kind of climatic effects that causes.
Okay. The ice age argument, these weather conditions, it says it only lasts like 10 years. How does that guarantee that no humans survive?
If it wipes out agriculture, I don't think we can really survive for 10 years or more. Even if a few people like are still alive, they're not able to like really live, and I think they'd eventually go extinct, which because they're
Okay.
lacking infrastructure and they're kind of
The line right under the Ice Age says, following the US-Russian nuclear war, which all of the card is actually in the context of US-Russia. You don't read a US-Russia scenario. How does this impact still apply?
the AF is about. I think the U.S. Russia would be a kind of would be a
Yeah,
scenario.
it'd be like an example, but that doesn't prove the AF makes like a separate claim because it's not like the same types of war that's occurring. So if it's not in the context of like your advantage, how do we come to this conclusion?
Well, I think first the AF is in the context of U.S. Russia because a lot of the evidence is in the context of Russia. Like I think one of the like multiple of the open sour cards talk about Russian strategy and how Russia would react to U.S. weapons. I think regardless if it was like a U.S.-China war, for example, the effects would still happen because they still have significant nuclear arsenals.
3 framing advantage. I'll send the doc. Okay, I sent it. Let me know when you guys both got it.
I'll let you know when I get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm good.
Okay. Holden.
I am now good, yeah.
Okay, cool. Interpretation the affirmative can't read epsilon Gaussian extinction impact value. She standards interviews reading extinction affirmative has 100% magnitude, which means pairing up with epsilon modesty. All you have to do is put marginal defense to auto win on substance that justifies an AF every round because the ties of impact, which also interlinked to clash since there's no reason for the AF's engagement. Given it's an auto win fairness, it's a variation space complexity that intrinsically requires equal footing when participating to minimize one's ability to participate in discussion, just to trust the other members of the activity. Drop the beta first turns per runs, reading the views, practicing the features, and it's not worth risking the loss, which key north since setting indefensible harness to die a second times you. Otherwise, you will read a bunch of abuse for the time to 3 epsilon speed threats or even speed, so it's possible to value the rest of the competing interest first means to increase the upper is the bottom of what counts as sufficient fair, which incentivizes much abuse. Also, second is norms and encourage the most favorable through debate and critiquing modesty is judgment, reasonability begs question of what the judge thinks is sufficient, which takes around outside debate understands RBS first rating. Incentivizes people abuse and script counters from another argument, which increases the existing background seconds and forces debaters to argue for bad practices, even if they realize their interest wrong, which kills the debates and norms since they have bad theory. So we agree on. Next off, interpretation. The affirmed defends a consequential frameworks based on they explicitly delineate which text is the good. They defend the form of the text, and when you see each nuance of the ethic entails different obligations, so it exclude other different offenses. There are 7 different versions. Mastin. Consequential theories include hedonism, which holds that pleasure is more important, and individuals maximize their own pleasure. Epicureanism defines happiness as tranquility. Egoism holds good for itself as status, and the opposite of egoism describes abstinence to achieve its spiritual goal. Altruism prescribes actions for everyone except himself. It holds role consequentialism. Following rules chosen on consequences. Those rules have negative consequentialism, focuses on minimizing bad consequences rather than promoting a violation. They don't, and maximizing expected well-being doesn't cut it crisp. What well-being consists of is of an independent interest. In the case of utilitarianism, standards distinguish theories of well-being as either humanistic desire or objectivist theory. Standards first shifting to consider out of my terms based on whatever theory they operate under due to the nature of a standard, especially because the warrants for the standard could justify different versions of contrasts coming first, and I would know which until 1 year, which is a huge access to multiple conditions. And second is shots I lose 6 minutes of time during the AC degenerate strategy because I don't know what turns which I should go for the one end, which proves cost me doesn't calculate since what is cure after this few theories double makes my result since we can't wait with different mechanisms for the good. Balance hard would make the link harder into a hedonist conception. You need to wing ground is key since it interest with compare arguments that clashes to actions to valid next off. Skepticism is true first, not arbitrary, and ethical beliefs cannot rely on arbitrary foundations as it would justify infinite contradiction. For instance, one could easily claim the sky is without any ability for refutation as it accords with an arbitrary mindset. However, ethics or arbitrary because they argue from evolution. Metra 18. Natural selection forge capacities to moral judgment. It does not require the morality to be true, only that it be evolutionary advantageous. Evolution is aimed not at processes that are reliable, but adaptive humans are therefore disposed to moral judgment regardless of evidence. Individuals more fit of his desires to help ourselves by a sense of requirement that strengthens his motivation. Moral beliefs are accidentally feel unjustified. Second is justified beliefs do not provide sufficient reason because they're merely suggestions. Believe that's rather than a proof of the truth of X light or 1. Every morality can be dialectically justified, but reasons for morality do not secure the truth. Every morality can have the appearance of being justified. Dialectical justifications fail. There are no objective facts about moral propositions, such as possible contrary justifications. They answer psychological needs of philosophers' apparent justifications because diversity of psychological needs of persons always possible for whom their premises are acceptable. 3, we can't find truth since we can never skip arbitrary foundations. There is street in which we see all new arguments. Street 6, one does not stand apart from one's starting a value judgment. Rather, one reasons terms that we test our judgments only by a value consistent with our value judgments. The tools of rational reflection were equally contaminated. All our reflections process has been a process of assessing a value judgments in terms of others that are mostly off the mark. Appeal to rational reflection offers no escape from the conclusion that most of our value judgments are likely to be false. 4 is culpably ethics must hold dangerous culpable, as otherwise we can not be responsible for moral wrongdoing since they occur externally to our rules and will happen regardless of whether we advise against them. However, willing fails and agent lacks control. Coin 12. We are collections of molecules and must obey the laws of physics. Neurons and molecules in our brain are the products of your genes and environments. Everything that you do must conduct molecules. 3 rules required is to somehow step outside of the brain structure. We are simply constructs that I prefer. Additionally, 8 is ground. It's the only thing that has equal quality quantity of our ground on both sides. If another firm is ignored, it would prescribe an absolute obligation to either the affirmative, which allows debaters to make arguments without true quality to them, which means this is purely test skill. B points fill, and all more firms in the question of how to resolve skepticism, which means it controls into all of the just education sees for real world interrogating the internal warrants of every argument's foundations, key to developing advocacy for responding to everyone who disagrees by being able to answer all their objections. Step negates first, accept the conclusion being triggers permissibility, denies them moral obligations. This that negates 8 semantics. Odd is defined as an obligation, which means absent a pro obligation. You vote next instruction needs privilege obligations permissibly improve one disputes the other. Point safety is efficacy we presume those since we know what to disclose, but we can't know where the applicant or ethics and coherency is logic, proposition, or positive justification for reading subject. Otherwise, one would be forced acceptability, logic, contrary, proposition, partisan, subject to one and something. I one knew nothing about P1 was presumed to be not pure true. Seconds presumption means 8 points probably. There are an infinite number of ways presuming false, and only once near the way to prove true. So it's more likely false. The F is false. B points policy failure. If we accepted every proposal for that reason, would be impossible for governments to institute every policy because governments would be policies to be equally good, which transactions, C points reciprocity, presuming all obligations true would require the app to dispute an infinite of alternate obligation that would treat off with the app is presuming each one is false means the one-to-one burden proof. The resolution is good. 3 is skeptical linguistically negated because sentence deriving from the linguistic properties corresponding facts by reality. For example, a claim like my dog has 4 legs requires you to have a dog, and for that dog to actually have 4 legs, it means morality, and that doesn't exist. This statement is false. The case, the framework overview, usual trigger steps. 8 points, there's an infinite anti-stage action that meaning we can never know if it's good or bad as per util because there would be possible there's many ways. For example, util having saved 2 babies rather than 1, but there's a chance that baby turns out to be Hitler, which keeps util time my actions. B points aggregation is possible since there is no way to quantify different amounts of pain and pleasure. How can 2 headaches equal migraine C induction parameters? Either it's true that we can predict the outcome of the situation, or we cannot infer no situation is ever replicated exactly, and even if we can, there's no guarantee the outcome will be the same. If we can predict the situation, that means everyone's can, which means we will always predict each other making a paradox action. So first, we always attempt to predict the outcomes of each other's action and cancel obligations. C is consequence empirically impossible to predict. Men 5. A long-term study paid 284 people who made their living offering advice on political and economic trends. Experts made 82,361 forecasts. The experts perform more safety assigned and equal probability of outcomes. Human beings are poor forecasts and dark and monkeys. They framework line by line all the intuitions. Only first trigger steps to be can't be bound to them either. There's no normative validation. The second, double either A, people operating their own intuition, which means the framework can justify any particular actions, or B, there is a universal intuition that empirically done because the divergence of moral theory on binding means no, people empirically don't bind to them, which means that we don't need to follow them. I saving someone else instead of yourself is an example of self-sacrifice that doesn't follow in line with the theory. The util-lexical argument 1 proves the framework is only instrumental, whereas ours describe where that doesn't describe intrinsic to subject side and self-defeating. You always just try to solve the smallest side risk is harm, which actually trade-offs with the actual ethical calculus. The A-spike argument versus is a false just because since it's util needs right seconds empirically disproven. Governments are self-interested, which is why they have laws in the first place. On the act mission distinction means there's infinite obligations to every inaction is more wrong, which means action proves that we can't follow your framework. On intent force at first always hold hostage because you never have to choose between bad outcome from taking action, even if there might be some benefits. Second, no objective way to hold people responsible for certain foreseen events, since each person foresees varying levels and types of consequences. To also prove that your framework fails. The calculates arguments no. 1, we can't use your framework because it's impossible to resolve, so it's illogical. Second, you need to prove that your framework is optimal, not just sufficient. Ensures that we have the robust ethical theories in order to not come to bad conclusions. The epistemic modesty arguments first cycling to impact contingent within the framework. For example, extinction's worst impact under util, whereas for Kant, any violation was infinite violence. Second, destroys for education, incentivizes debaters from resolving the issue because they can just read the extinction say a 0.001% always destroying clash. On the clash argument specifically, no frameworks constrain our ability of understanding substance, which proves it's a prerequisite to the Broward arguments. First, causes policy immobility because it's infinite max because we can't weigh between competing scenarios. Second, impact justified because it presumes life being good, which circumfails the purpose of ethics. 3 is escaping treatment that your deliberation could be violent because we could come to a violent conclusion, and foregoing life then in that scenario would be something that's bad as per your framework. So just didn't read the advantage stuff. Everything else was read.
Okay, good for cross.
Yeah.
Okay, real quick on the util framework page, can you just list all the arguments that are independent reasons as to why you would win that are made on the case framework page outside the big overview, like on the line by line?
Yeah. On intuitions, there is a trigger step argument because we can't be bound to them because there's no normative evaluation of different intuitions. The act omission argument could be like a skep trigger. The argument was that there's infinite obligations if every inaction is a moral wrong, which moots action because we can't follow your framework because there's like, an infinite amount of them. Yeah, and then on the Boschem evidence, skep being true means that your deliberation could be violence because we're like preserving a future that could be potentially bad. I think those were the only independent ones, yeah.
Okay. Were there any other arguments made against the argument about rejecting calc indites? What was the argument made on there?
Yeah, the first one was that we can't use your framework if it's impossible to resolve, so it's illogical in the context of like debate. And then the second one is that you need to prove that your framework is optimal instead of just sufficient, so that we have robust ethical theories in order to not come to like wrong conclusions.
Okay, that's fine. And what was the B point made on intuition besides the argument you already gave about different intuition?
Yeah, there is a double bind. The A point of that double bind was that if people operate under their own like personal intuitions, you can't have a guiding action because every individual has their own personal belief of what is intuitive. Or B, there is a universal intuition, but like that's just impossible because of the divergence of moral theory, which our skep cards prove and is also just like empirically true.
Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about skepticism. I guess is murder a bad thing?
The NC doesn't take a stance on like whether you should take moral actions. It just says the logical conclusion of the SCLO is like in skepticism. So it's not like ascribing action. So that question is irrelevant.
It doesn't. Okay, so if somebody is being like murdered and you have the ability to just stop that, you should not do that action.
It's not saying that you should or shouldn't. It's just like that's not relevant. There's no proactive like argument saying that you shouldn't save them.
Okay, so if you could like press a button, you have the option to, and it would stop like all hate
crimes in like 10 different ways, but that doesn't change my answer. So you should.
There's no. It doesn't matter either way what you do.
It's not that it doesn't matter. It's just there's no normative force in guiding your action.
Okay, that's fine. I guess the like framework spec stuff. What ground did you lose? Because I didn't spec like hedonism.
The ground loss could occur in the 1 AR. For example, if you like shift to just like body counts, for example, like as some sort of objective metric, you could shift out of permissibility triggers. In terms of like disads, it affects weighing. Either way, it operates under norm settings, so it's not really a relevant question.
I'll pick prep. I had 115 left. There is no doc. The order is the theory shells in order, the case, starting on offense and then on the framework, finally on skepticism.
Sounds good. I'm ready.
Holden, you good?
Yep. Wait, is there a doc?
There is no doc.
All right, I'm good then.
All right, let me just grab a sip of water, then I'll give the speech. One sec, let me adjust my flow. All right. Okay, is anyone not ready? Cool. Shell number one counter, I can read epistemic modesty with an extinction impact that benefits. First, other frameworks also have infinite impacts. For example, infinite offense under skepticism or infinite offense under Kant, which means it's non-unique. Second, you can just read an extinction impact yourself, which means you still get access to the infinite offense under epistemic modesty. Third is that you can just win probabilities more relevant to other impacts. We don't do the meta weighing for you, which means we just say you should do weighing between framework and offense, but you can argue which direction that should lean towards. For example, reading structural balance impacts. Also, fourth is reasonability. It's best to get to substance, but it's best for education. Otherwise, we would just be debating theory all the time and get no actual real education, which is applicable to what we'll do in the real. For example, going to college and studying policy. The line by line stuff, though, yeah, all your offenses, all your offenses silly. That it doesn't have an actual effect, which is answered above the competing justifications. You say race to the margin, no, it's silly. There's no actual example for why this would be true. Race to the top is not worse, as explained above. You say norming, no, it doesn't have a norm because online debate has no kind of impact. For example, nobody even knows who won the TOC last year because it was online. They say it's also not justified in the specific round. They say judge intervention, no, mutual pref solve because we both pref Holden because we like the way they make decisions. It's also inevitable, and judge will always have to make arbitrary decisions because there's a lack of clash in LD rounds. The next shell counter, I meet your offense. There's a hedonistic conception of mutual specified and Nagel. I also defend the violation. I don't have to specify. I don't have to specify your theory. Forcing us to specify is bad. First, arbitrary, nonsensical. There's no reasonable basis, which makes interpretation unpredictable. Close clash, since we don't know how to meet their interpretation. Second, internal regress. How much specification is enough? They can add infinite impossible conditions, so we never meet, which kills clash. And reading normal means evidence solves their offense, and is that better because we get a discussion. Second, third, there's no offense because you can just read a definition, ask us in cross-text, and we defend all utility in the one I see. Fourth, reasonability crossway from above the line by line. They say shift. No, there's no ground. There's no ground loss. Extinction is worse under all the frameworks. If you really want to read Benatar or something, we can have the debate, but there's no reason we should specify the one I see. They say strats, no loss as above. They say resolvability, no, it's bad under all frameworks absent additional interrogation. The case. First, the offense, it was totally conceded afterwards nuclear war from happening because an arms race and miscalculation occur due to the development of lethal response weapons, which causes nuclear war fast, kills literally everybody, which is offense under our framework of utilitarianism and independently offense under framework of extinction outweighing the framework top level. Going for the Nagel evidence, it is good. You should look at this evidence after London. It's excellent explaining why we are averse to pain, because it is just something that is kind of built into us that we know to be the case. For example, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you know that is a bad thing. That is a moral situation because you are kind of bound to do that action again, which is always all the other theories because it's most binding insofar as you only act to kind of maximize your own well-being and maximize the well-being of others, because we can kind of understand that because we should maximize our own well-being, since other people have the same evolution as us and have the same kind of fundamental understanding as us, and we should also maximize their well-being because it's ethical it's ethical all around, which also always intuition's net away because we need some kind of basis for ethics. Skepticism is a net bad thing because otherwise we would have no ethical basis whatsoever, which means having one is better than not having one because intuitively it would prevent massive atrocities. The line by line stuff first on the top level, they say infinite possible end states. No, that doesn't matter insofar as you can just kind of arbitrarily cut your calculations up after evaluating actions too far. They say aggregation is impossible. Yes, you can. We'll spec a hedonistic definition as per the theory page, which means we can kind of sum up different levels of dopamine in the brain. They say induction paradox. No, induction obviously doesn't fail. Induction also would take out deduction, which means you need some kind of obviously induction does work. Otherwise it's the reason you wouldn't jump off a building, for example, because you know it would cause harm to you. They say consequences are impossible to predict. Obviously not true because you can still make some kind of good prediction. For example, we know that kind of stabbing somebody with a knife, it would be a bad thing. It would cause a bad consequence. The line by line stuff. They say on intuitions. They say it triggers skepticism, causes a double way. No, there is a universal intuition, even if it's not every single intuition is universal. The fundamental ones that kind of justify util are the ones that justify util are kind of fundamental. They say act omission causes infinite possible actions. No, you can kind of just make arbitrary cutoffs, which is argument made above. They say that also that. They say skepticism would also solve for Bostrom. I'm not going for that argument. I can see defense on it. Finally, the skep page. Top level one rejects skepticism. It's morally abhorrent. You should not allow for it insofar as it would justify not taking action in the face of atrocities, which is bad in debate specifically because it's a place where people should feel safe. Second, it's unfair because it's a nib because there's infinite possible skeptical growth. Answer third, epistemic modesty would take it out. Epistemic modesty is good in the context of skeptic because there's no actual offense under the skeptical theory, which means you should kind of default to having any framework. The arbitrary foundation stuff, no, intuition as a basis is good. Escaping skep is a net good thing because there's a shared consensus on the case page. They say justified beliefs do not justify actions. It's just an assertion. They say that never escape arbitrary foundation. Same as point one. They say culpability doesn't matter because ethics are a function of states of affairs, not specific actions you take, which means you should not vote for skep. Risk of offense means you go to.
Okay. It's 5 minutes, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it's 5 minutes.
Okay. Can I have the last responses on the skep flow?
With
anything,
Lima
after,
stuff?
anything after lighter.
Anything after? Sorry, which one was later? I just saw the warrant. Sorry.
Yeah, your argument was like it's just an assertion.
Yeah, the argument. Let me look what I said. Yeah, this is just an assertion. If it's a debate, if I'm winning an argument, you should kind of take it to be true.
Okay. Anything else after that?
Yeah, I said on the arbitrary foundation stuff, same as point one. On the culpability stuff, it doesn't matter because ethics is a function of states of affairs, not individual actions. We can still act to maximize states of affairs and still have a coherent ethical theory.
Okay, thank you. What was the fourth overview argument to skep? It was like an intuition argument.
The fourth overview argument.
Yeah.
Let me look what I said. I did not make a fourth overview argument. I made 3 overview arguments, then jumped to line by line.
Oh yeah, what was the intuition argument then?
Yeah, I said this was a response to the 1 and 3 points about kind of arbitrary ethical foundations. I said no, intuition as a basis of ethics is good as per the Nagel evidence. Even if every single intuition we have is not perfectly aligned, we can still have certain low-level shared intuitions across the human species. And escaping skep kind of on face is a good thing because it is good to kind of have obligations. On face plus obligations and necessitate the existence of a good, which means that even if there's any risk that intuitions would kind of lead to having obligations, we should, trust those intuitions.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, that was time. The order will be overview on the shells, skep, the AF framework.
Okay, I'm good.
I'm good as well.
Fixing my scan. One sec. Is anyone not ready right now? Okay. Where's my file? Okay. Overview on the shells all concede reasonability. They don't have an RBI, which means they can't go for the theory flows. Next, go on to the skep flow for overview arguments. First, truth matters, and we should hold ourselves accountable to the truth of whether skep is true or false. There's an outcomes argument. It's logical and actively violent to disregard the truth when it's the nature of the world. For example, climate skeptics acting like climate change is fake when it isn't is violent because we would all just have like bad effects in the world, which proves that you shouldn't value the ethos of the two or just the tech of the two. And our second is resolvability. If 2 + 2 can never equal 5, and disregarding the true answer makes rounds irresolvable because there's no standard the judge can be held to. Such decisions can never be made. That's key because all of their objections are just reasons why it would be good if skep weren't true, but no offensive reasons as to why they should disprove the substance of the skep theory first. Second, overview arguments. You should view morality like a checklist where the AF has the burden to disprove all skeptical attacks to the foundations of their theory. For example, even if they win one standard justification, the Nagel argument, but they lose that framework can't be action guiding, they automatically lose under the normative burden that they have set by reading the ethical framework. They have to beat back every single one of these arguments. So winning one justification for why skep is true means that you always vote negative. Fourth, next is that you should evaluate the framework to be through a question of epistemic confidence. Look, they haven't extended reasons why epistemic modesty is true, but they've conceded objections to it. And so third overview argument, I'll handle that on case. Independently, epistemic confidence is good. First is it's impossible to determine the probability of the framework and the offense being true as truth isn't scalar. Second is that modesty assumes outside knowledge or judge biases on whether certain arguments are true, which trades off with competitive equity and is going to be an argument that you should frame the entirety of the round. Next, next is this argument about whether or not skep is true or not. I'm going to extend the lighter evidence that says that moral justifications appear to be dialectically justified, which means that you might think that they appeared at a truth level. However, in reality, every justified belief derives from psychological differences of different philosophers, i.e. everyone has different opinions that appeal to their own preferences or intuitions of what the world should like, which is going to be answer all of their intuitions claim because it straight turns why we can't follow those intuitions in the first place, because they don't result in a metaphysical truth, because a human's viewpoint doesn't shape up to our world. For example, Kant believed a universal standpoint in ethics is good, where someone like Mills takes into account that there is a subjective positions into coming up with their own understanding of the truth. Everyone has their own reason to come up with an ethic, but that doesn't mean that any sort of ethic is actually true in the first place. That is going to be a skep. That's going to be skep offense because it proves that dialectical justifications are just psychological preferences to different agents. Their argument on this was just it's an assertion. No, you've asserted that it's just an assertion. Only I've evaluated actual offense for why this proves that we don't have a normative binding force insofar as every different philosopher, every single individual just has their own personal preferences that don't shape up to the metaphysics of what the world actually is. The argument, the second argument he made was that you should just assume that like my arguments are to be made to be true. No, that's not how debate works, especially when you're conceding presumption negates. I'll extend that here. Infinite ways for your arguments to be false, but there's only one way for them to be true, which means any risk of skepticism means that it takes out your ability for whether or not we should just auto accept AF arguments, even in the question of the intuitions argument. The next argument that you made on the evolution argument, I'm not going for it, which means it shouldn't matter, but I'll answer this intuition argument. No, that's not how arguments work. I.e., individuals have their own preferences of intuitions because there's literally something that's self-evident to some individual, but that doesn't shape up to how we actually like act within the real world because everyone can't be acting upon some sort of universal argument. Your argument about we have like some low-level shared argument doesn't make sense because there's no normative guiding force or any sort of resolvable metric for what shared propositions out like. That's going to be pretty devastating because it proves that we can't follow these intuitions and they're not something that's universally applicable. Skep negates. You can see the permissibility argument. Skepticism denies the ability to have moral obligation and triggers permissibility. Permissibility negates. They've conceded. Extend the semantics argument. The audience defines having obligation. So in order to vote after resolution requires for a proactive obligation to the affect presupposed morality exists. Skep denies the semantics outweighs. It's key to predictability since you cover the wording of the resolution and is considered to the rules of debate since the judge is obligated to vote on the resolution text, which means even if there's a 0.001% risk of skep being true, it takes out the app because they need to prove a universal normative reason for why ought proves that you should affirm. It's the burden as per the resolution, which proves they haven't met that burden. The overview arguments, the justifies atrocities argument one, you can say that X is bad that. All SCEP says is that there's no normative force to will any action. In other words, we don't have moral obligation, which means that the framework never wills anything morally repugnant in the first place, so we don't have to will that in the first place. Second is there's an act-omission distinction. You can't hold people morally culpable for omissions because there's an infinite amount of actions to take, so omissions will always exist. You've conceded this on the framework page, which proves it's devastating. Given this frame, the act trying to hold SCEP culpable for an omission of not being able to resolve repugnant scenarios does not matter insofar as one that SCEP doesn't proactively justify anything immoral and so on. Third, SCEP controls whether you're right, whether you're using the right framework to stop atrocities. It also does not actually say every attempt at ethics is bad, just that your specific one isn't enough to meet the threshold of being normative. Four, there's a post-fiat distinction that solves this argument. My argument is in the context of creating truth claims, not moral actions outside of the bound, which proves that these argument responses don't matter. The NIBS arguments, you haven't properly justified what is reason to drop the team independently. That's key for negative strategy. The has infinite private access to plans, firms, and one area resource control is directions between 3 minutes to collapse and one argument that gives them a sizable strategic and substantive advantage. Names are key to check because it doesn't matter how much prep the one area has, because I'm not forced to go for the argument because you can't generate offense. Next track outweighs abstract arguments. 8 points the one area is more species to adapt to various in strategy, which means there are more chance for recovery. B points the app has better prevent forces. They plan their strategic moves based on the arguments, but the negatives react to. Second is Philed. You'd exclude SCEP determines monism, theories, epistemology, etc., which kills Philed. That's consistent to LD because NSD defines LD as a values activity that controls the internal link to all other arguments. There's no other argument on the framing page of the SCEP argument, but all of these were just defensive in the first place, which means they shouldn't matter. Next, let's go into the utility. I'm going to extend one of the reasons why utility is irresolvable. Extend the Menant evidence. Empirics prove that even the best experts can't make accurate predictions. Menant evidence did conduct a survey for 20 years with over 82,000 forecasts. There were 200 best political and economic leaders in the world, and they predicted worse than if they randomly assigned equal probability to everyone. That's just how irresolvable your framework is. If old and trained experts can't predict decisions, you should not trust teenagers with evaluating consequences and resolving the round based off of util. That proves that their framework is irresolvable and something that's impossible to engage in. Their only argument is it's just not true because they can make some predictions, but no, that's an assertion that the 1AR has made. But we read an actual study that proves that that is not something that's true, which means you can't evaluate it in the context of the Menant evidence because it's an empirical study saying that we can't use their framework. You have no framework to evaluate offense under. There's only like overview arguments to SCEP that don't apply, given that there's like 5 points on each of them. Don't allow the 2AR to classify arguments from one SCEP argument to another because I didn't go for them and they just don't apply, which means it'll be really new in the 2AR.
Okay, taking prep, one question. What was the 3 point on the justified atrocities?
Yeah. SCEP controls whether you're using the right moral framework to stop atrocities.
Okay, that's fine.
Samir, I'm at 140 right now.
Oh, sorry. I apologize. When I started doing prep, I thought it was 4 minutes, but it's actually 5 minutes, so I had an extra minute. So I have like, I think 30 seconds or so left.
Okay, yeah, cool.
Yeah, sorry about that confusion. I'll resume prep now. Okay, the order is case, offense, then framework, then skep. Skep starts with an overview, and then the line by line stuff. All right, is anyone not ready? Okay. Conceded case offense, the plan is a good idea under the utilitarian framework because it prevents nuclear war from happening, because lethal weapons cause miscalculation and escalation, which causes arms kills literally everybody on Earth, which is obviously a bad thing under util because extinction would cause a net harm and cause pain and a lack of pleasure. The frame, which means that's offense under util. The framework stuff, util is a true framework. Going for the intuition argument and the negative evidence. Evidence is good. It indicates that if you put your hand on a hot stove, you just know it is bad, even if there's no kind of logical, fully rational reason. You just know it is a bad thing because of low-level evolutionary intuition that are showed across the entire human species. There's kind of nobody who thinks that pain. There's nobody who thinks that the kind of satisfying their preferences is a bad thing, because people kind of just logically know that it's a good thing for literally everybody on Earth. They have their own utility function that they wish to maximize, which means that if you kind of logically understand that, you should also be able to apply that to other agents and be able to maximize their respective utility functions as well, which means utilitarianism as a theory is ethically coherent and has justifications. The only argument they make in response into utilitarianism is this argument about you cannot make predictions. This is obviously absurd, and even if they have a quote unquote empirical study, that doesn't matter. You shouldn't just kind of default to what's most empirical. It's kind of a bad form of weighing, and you should kind of default to what's most logical and reasonable. Obviously, you can make some predictions. For example, if I drop my phone right now and it hits the floor, I can kind of logically understand that it might break or it will hit the ground. Just because policymakers might have some problems making kind of after predictions, the figure does not mean you cannot make any predictions whatsoever. Which means, at worst, this is a reason where there's less of a risk of the act being true, but there's still some non-zero risk of the act being true, insofar as there's no reason that some other potential consequence would happen. Which means that even if they're winning, that they make bad predictions, it doesn't matter, because there's always a risk that their prediction is correct, which means you would still vote according to this thing. Obviously, even if it's an empirical study, it's kind of silly and doesn't kind of adhere with logic and intuition. The skep stuff. Couple top level reasons as to why you should vote affirmative on the skep page. First, it justifies moral atrocities, insofar as their explanation of skepticism was that it just doesn't kind of take a stance on whether you should have an obligation. You can still recognize good and bad, but you should not act towards those things. That is obviously absurd, because it justifies being silent and complicit in the face of atrocity. For example, if there's a murder happening, it would justify not doing anything aside the murder, even if you could do it with no harm to yourself or others. Or if there was some kind of racism or kind of other form of oppression happening, you would be okay just kind of not doing anything, and it would be perfectly fine, even if that is a bad thing. That is obviously absurd. A debate should be a safe space, because people in this activity might face some forms of oppression, which means we should not be able to kind of we should not allow for any framework or argument that justifies being silent and complicit in the face of oppression, because it only allows those things to perpetuate. Even the line by line stuff, they say that you can say X thing is bad but no obligation. No, that was addressed in kind of in this overview argument that I just explained. They say activation distinction means it doesn't matter. Obviously, still silly, because you can see that this one's activation distinction, which is that we can just make arbitrary cutoffs and kind of not evaluate every single possible action we take. They say that skep says there are no atrocities. This is kind of a reason as to why skep would be a bad thing. They say pre-post distinction. This is also kind of silly, because obviously your theory would still apply to things in the real world. The second reason you should vote affirmative on skep is that it's just not a logical reason to negate. This is distinct from the modesty versus confidence stuff, and the warrants doesn't apply. There's no need to determine the precise probability that skep is true, util is true. Just the argument is just that if there's any risk that util is true, or there's any risk that skep is false, you should automatically default to voting act, because skep assigns no preference either way to take an action or not to take an action, but util says you should take an action. Which means if you have two indices, one says you can do either thing, it doesn't matter. The other one says you should specifically take one. You should obviously take the one, because it maximizes the chance of being morally correct. If there's any non-zero risk that util is a true theory, you should obviously take the action under util, which means the plan is still a good idea, even if they're winning util, or that skep has a risk of being true. Good debate.
All right. I'm in. Is everyone here?
Yeah.
I'm here.
Cool. Emmy, you said you were here.
Yeah.
Cool. Good debate to both of you. This was a nice round for me to wake up to in the morning. I ended up voting negative on skepticism. I think that there are a few framing issues I have to sort of go through in this debate. I'm gonna kind of like list them. First, or few places that made me sort of pause. First was this sort of independent voter. And to be fair, I think that the 2AR is probably right on this question, or on a truth value, but there are a few key arguments that sort of frame my value, that sort of frame my balance. Sorry, I can't really speak right now. First is this 2NR argument about how tech over truth matters, and that even if the 2AR ethos is on the side of truth, that I should minimize the impact of that, since it leads to irresolvable debates, i.e. what happens when we have two true claims competing against each other. Uh, and how do I determine what is more true? Which sort of just begs the question of tech being inevitable. That means that I think that the 2NR here sort of wins this tech level argument about how the act omission distinction means that there is a sort of cutoff to the way which we can evaluate our actions. That means that sure, in some infinite world, skepticism may justify uh, ignoring moral atrocities, but that doesn't mean I should have that in my moral purview, because there is always going to be some sort of let me exact phrasing. Uh, oh yeah, uh, that does not mean that I have to sort of have that within my moral purview. I think that the 2AR argument, or that the 2AR response to this, was relatively short and kind of blippy, which means that I don't really have the ability to sort of catch the warrant. All I have is like arbitrary cutoffs exist. That may have been because I'm tired and it's early in the morning, or because the 2AR didn't really extrapolate more on that. Either way, I think that uh, some more sort of impacting out of that argument probably could have done you some well, or done you some good. So then the next argument that I sort of have to go through, or that I sort of had to pause on, was this predictions argument. Because if you're running the util framework, then there's maybe a risk of this sort of intuitions argument on the skep page. But if you aren't winning util, then that util is a binding action, then that sort of takes out a lot of the arguments on the skep page. And I think that predictions fail. I think that the 2AR on this was incredibly new, given that the 1AR response to the Menand evidence was just like, some kinds of predictions can be true and we can make those, but that doesn't really respond to a lot of the 2NR framing here, i.e. how the Menand study was a predictive study of 80,000, 9,000 experts making individual predictions about individual situations, meaning that if they can't make anything, if they can't do things right, then how can the high school debate, or then how can utilitarianism guide action, because there's no sort of way for us to ensure that our predictions will be true, which means that we can't really evaluate those consequences, which means that these intuitions arguments sort of doesn't make sense, because most times our intuition fails, which means that it triggers person permissibility, because there's always going to be some sort of other intuition that may be true, which means that it doesn't guide action, which means it negates. Then finally is this sort of question about whether or not skepticism negates, and I think it does. I think that the 2NR makes it abundantly clear that permissibility negates, and that if skep triggers permissibility, then that also negates, that means that skep negates, which means that I end up thinking it does. I think that the 2AR/1AR needs to do a couple of things. First, I think you could have done some good with putting an RVI on the shells. It would have made the 2NR harder and split. Next, I also think that the what's the word? Oh, yeah. I also think that the 1AR needs to sort of impact out some of these arguments more, i.e. impact out some kinds of predictions are true, or make more arguments on the Menand evidence, because the Menand evidence is probably the strongest consequences available on this in the 1 and C, then I also think that you should probably put a dump of like permissibility of firms in the 1AR, which means that if SCEP triggers permissibility, then that means I vote F. It also means that the 2AR, that the 2NR has to engage in another level of legal debate, which splits explanation even more, which means that it could have given you the opportunity to sort of win on some other argument on the flow.
Can I ask a few questions?
Sure.
Okay. With the skepticism justifies atrocities argument, do you think the only argument the tuner was winning was the act omission distinction, or do you think even if I beat back the act omission distinction, I would have to also like do more work on the other arguments?
I just listed that out because I thought it was the most convincing to an R argument. I'm sure that if I like sorted through it first, I think that you would also have to probably beat back, or I think that you'd also have to beat back this like pre-post fiat distinction means that the that you should disregard the independent voter because it's not impacted out to like post fiat justifications, but rather just like some sort of pre-fiat reason for why you should reject the team. I think that you probably need to beat that back still, or sort of
Okay.
like point out how it either links to an ethical framework or how it sort of still weighs on like a post fiat level.
Okay. Second question, real quick, is on the risk analysis stuff I did at the very bottom of the 2AR. Do you think if I explain that as a reason not why SCEP doesn't negate, but as a reason why SCEP doesn't trigger permissibility, you would have been more open to voting for it, or do you think you would have the same decision?
Oh, so like this 1% of util being correct or SCEP being false means that I vote F kind of stuff?
Yes. Yeah.
I think that impacting it out more as sort of like maybe like a double bind, like some sort of double bind argument saying that like even either SCEP is, or sorry, not a double bind, but this argument saying that it's try or die, even if there's a risk that skepticism is probably true, if there's a 1% risk that util is also true and SCEP is false, then that means that rejecting util and accepting SCEP on face entirely is probably violent because it ignores infinite possibilities in which we can do morally good actions and prevent mass suffering.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
I just have one question. For the tuner, are there any like changes I could have made to make it better?
I think that given the 1AR, conceding the shells was probably the best move in going for SCEP. I do think that you need to maybe incorporate some, or no, actually, I think that answering the independent voter like heavily was probably the right move. I just think that you maybe need to like flesh out some of the arguments more and do a little bit more weighing, because that, for example, I think that weighing like the independent voter justifications and like the permissibility trigger on util would probably make it a lot easier for me to sort of disregard a lot of the 2AR arguments, since the 2AR had some weighing in there, but like not enough for me to sort of disregard just like the tech value of a lot of these things. So like 2NR weighing in this instance would then just allow me to sort of like disregard or either just decide negative a lot easier here. For example, if
What does that weighing look like? Like an example?
I think that, for example, maybe this post fiat distinction argument saying that this outweighs because it prevents irresolvable debates, meaning this outweighs because it prevents irresolvable debates, i.e. Us having to decide whether or not a pre-fiat impact that has some sort of implication of safety versus a post-fiat impact with some sort of implication towards like real world violence, because having to decide between either causes like infinite, or causes us to ignore like legitimate instances in which we can either help the real world or sort of help within the debate round, which leads to like violent debates.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.